Good afternoon, and welcome to our faculty panel on open educational resources. My name is Christina Hendricks. I'm the academic director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, and also a professor of teaching in philosophy at UBC Vancouver. And I'm here to introduce you to the panel who's going to be talking about various open educational resources projects they've been involved in over the last, year, 2 years, 3 years potentially, to just give you some ideas of the really interesting things that are happening around open educational resources here at UBC Vancouver. And I'm going to start for introducing our panel. I couldn't remember where I was starting. So we're going to start with Elise Yeager, who is an instructor in the Department of Mathematics. Then we have a project that was led by Leonora Crema from the UBC Library, but she could not be here today, so we have Erin Fields in her place, who is an open education specialist in the UBC Library. We have Agnes D'Entremont and Jonathan Verrett from mechanical engineering and chemical and biological engineering. And we also have Siobhan McElduff from the Department of Classical, Near Eastern, and Religious Studies. So we're going to be going in that order, which is not the same as this order, but we have slides, so it's important that we go in the right order to get the slides right. Each person is going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes about their project, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. But first, I'm going to say just a little bit about open educational resources in case there are people in the room who are not as familiar with the idea of open educational resources. So we've got up here a definition of OER from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. They just recently updated their OER definition, and this is the newest one. So it is teaching, learning, and research materials in any medium, digital or otherwise, that reside in the public domain or have been released under an open license that permits no-cost access, use, adaptation, and redistribution by others with no or limited restrictions. So there's a lot going on in there, but it is really any teaching and learning resource that can be anything from a text, a reading, a syllabus, assignment directions, to videos, to podcasts, to other sorts of digital objects that are licensed to be allowed to be reused by others without asking direct permission from the copyright holder, and often also allowed to be revised by others and free of cost to do so. So I wanted to mention also something that will come up in discussions of open educational resources quite often. This is what's called the 5R permissions from open education supporter advocate David Wiley. He came up with these in 2014. That's where the first blog post about the 5R permissions came up. So things that are as open as possible in terms of educational resources have these 5 permissions, meaning you're allowed to retain, to make, own, and control copies of the content. So that would be different than, say, a textbook that you have to rent and give access back, right? So it's something that you can retain. Reuse, it's material that can be reused in multiple ways. Revised, you can adapt it, you can modify it, you can edit it. Remix, you can combine one piece of material with something else or even a third thing and create an entirely new compilation. And redistribute, you're able to not only, let's say, make physical copies for students, but also post it on a publicly available website. So how do you get these permissions? Well, usually materials are given an open license. And the open license will tell you what permissions you have, and sort of the most open licenses will allow you all 5 of those permissions. And very frequently, open educational resources will have a Creative Commons license. Now, anybody who's not really familiar with Creative Commons licenses, on a website called the Open UBC website, URL is there, open.ubc.ca, we've got a toolkit that is open licensing basics for instructors and for students. So if you go to the Open UBC website and look up open education, then you'll find a link to the toolkits. Right? So often resources will have a Creative Commons license that allows those 5 permissions. So that was just a little bit of introduction. And now we're going to move straight into our panelists talking about the projects they've been involved in. Oh. Got a little notification on the top of the slide. Sorry about that. No big deal. Okay, so first off is Elise Yeager talking about CLP calculus. Yeah, or you can use this.
Well, this way I don't have
but
to
you need a mic because we're recording.
Okay, but if I'm here, I can't see. Okay.
You know
I'll
what?
just turn around.
AV support. Excellent.
Problem solving. Thank you. All right. Hi. My name is Elise, and I'm going to talk about our project called CLP Calculus. This is joint work with Joel Feldman, Andrew Rechnitzer, and me, and we're all from the math department. So the math has 4 series calculus course. So this is pretty standard. There's usually 4 semesters of calculus, and we have working textbooks for all 4 of these series, and these are some of the courses that they're being used in. The textbooks exist as sort of a standard PDF textbook, so students can grab them online for free, and then we're also in the process of turning them into web-based versions as well. So the first of the textbooks is the web-based version. You don't have to worry about word wrapping. Okay, so this started when Stewart Calculus, which is the sort of probably most famous textbook, put out a new edition. This is the first two books that came up on Amazon. They changed the content very little, put out a new edition, and jacked up the price quite a lot. So there's, people talk about free as in beer and free as in speech, and definitely free as in beer was a big motivation. I should also say that I wasn't involved when this started, so this is Andrew and Joel. There's also the free as in speech, which had less to do with the motivation to start, but a lot to do with the motivation to keep going. And then I asked my co-authors what else motivated you, and Andrew said unwarranted optimism. So Joel had notes that he already had that Andrew thought like, oh, it'll be really easy to turn this into a textbook, and that wasn't true. But then when I joined, mostly, it was a good project, but I thought it would be super fun, and I was correct. It is super fun. And none of us had any, right? Okay, so we started pretty much without student input. So Joel had the skeleton of the notes, Andrew turned them into a textbook, and I wrote the exercises. But then once we had a working draft, we started incorporating student input. So when these are being used by a class, you'll have easily 1,000 pairs of eyes on a chapter at a time. And so we offered a little bug bounty. So if you're in Calculus 1 and you see an error in the textbook, you report it to a graduate TA who sees if it's the first error. And if you're the first one to report it, then your teacher in front of the whole class kind of gives you a pat on the back and gives you like a card for a coffee at Loaf. So that's a really good way to involve students and also to get really quality copy editing. We also hired a work-learn student who was an undergrad when we hired him and a master's student when he left to think about accessibility and clarity. So he researched a bunch of accessibility and he gave us a style guide for things like which colors are distinguishable to people with different kinds of color blindness, where should you put the text in your figures so that screen readers can read them, things like that. And then he also unified the design in our figures to make them easier, and it's just a nicer text for him being involved. Student reaction's been very positive, largely because the free as in beer. Joel gave me some stats from the website. So in just the month of September 2019, we had 16,000 sessions, which is over about 10,000 from the same month in 2018. We had almost 8,000 users, which is up from 4,800 in the month of September 2018. And a lot of that growth is coming from outside of UBC, and we actually have no idea who these people are because anyone can access it. People don't ask, so we don't always know. Yes, so things that would have helped. One thing that we're still hoping to find a mechanism for is a bit more critical feedback. So the bug bounty is really good for saying, oh, there's a typo here, things like that. But for more critical reading, that's a tougher type of feedback to get. Once there was a skeleton, Again, the amount of work estimated in turning a skeleton into a book was vastly underestimated, and so a teaching buyout probably would have helped. And then things like the bug bounty, this was before these sort of nice OER grants were quite as active as they are, and it took a little bit of time to figure out how to fund that. So there's 4 books, and the first 2 are stable. The last 2, the text is stable, and we're still filling in some of the gaps in the exercise books. We have some updating to do now that we have style guidelines, just to kind of polish things and put things from PDF to the web. So there's a bit of polishing to do on the text itself, but then we've also branched out into some related projects. So my current pet project is something called Orchard. So we wrote a ton of exercises, and in PDF form, they're the same as a book, which is just, number 1, number 2, number 3. But that's not the best way we want our students to study them, right? So we're working on some software that will do problem recommendations. So problem 1, and then how was that? And then based on your answer, we'll recommend something else. And we also want to put it together with goal setting and tracking. So I'm going to write here that I want to study 3 times this week, and the computer is going to keep me up to date as to how I am on that goal and provide feedback that hopefully will be helpful towards meeting goals, and also maybe, if we're lucky, encourage a growth mindset. There's another textbook that recently went from $20 to $100. It's for Introduction to Proof. So one of my co-authors, Andrew, and also Sachkin Demirbaş in the math department are starting to develop a free version of that. And my co-author, Andrew, with too many people that I could name, is working on a paperless online marking system. So this is something like Gradescope or Crowdmark, but hopefully free and open source. Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Okay, and next is Leonora Crema is not here, but Erin Fields from the library.
Thank you. So forgive me, I'm working off of somebody else's notes and project, so I will do the best I can in speaking to it. So this project began in the spring of 2018 with a series of adjudicated subgrants to enlist faculty's interest in partnering in OER development with the library. So really, what did the library want to accomplish with this? Well, the growth of OER seemed to be happening on our campus for quite some time. And it's trying to kind of understand the library's role in that space, especially since open education is so closely related to open access in general, which is something the library has been considering for quite some time. We also wanted, with these projects, to think about how students could support this kind of work related to publishing of OERs, and specifically looking at how library students would be involved in this process. We wanted to have a better understanding of faculty needs for open education resource development and where those needs intersect with what the library can do in terms of service. And then we want to align with the UBC TLEF priorities in addition to the priorities from the library, and specifically again with open access being a focus. But mainly we wanted to explore the landscape of OERs on campus and the library's capacity to support faculty in creating of open education resources. So we secured a grant from the TLEF, the Teaching and Learning Enhancement Fund, for about $39,000 for a one-year project. The process was really that the library gave adjudicated subgrants of about $2,000 each to incentivize faculty partnerships. Half of the funds went to the faculty projects, while the other half went to the library to support project students. So there was a hiring of 2 GAAs to shore up some of the supports in the library around open education development. We didn't decline any of the projects. As long as it resulted in open content, it was considered to be a project that we would support. The project resulted in 10 faculty projects that were funded, and it was a mix of new works and enhancements to existing works, and it was across subject spectrum. So there was history, mathematics, geography, philosophy, social work, political science, and physics. So it was a good kind of cross the entire university, and it was with many formats. We didn't restrict it specifically to publishing an open text, so it was textbooks, there was videos, simulations, and more beyond that. So we also shored up some of the work that was using Pressbooks due to there's robust service from BC Campus to support Pressbook use. Specifically, we use their iteration of Pressbooks that any person associated to an academic institution has access to. But we quickly found that other platforms such as Overleaf would potentially have served some of the projects maybe better than Pressbooks would. And there was a need for very specific knowledge, specifically around LaTeX. We took a publishing life approach, which means we accepted author-proofed content with no copy editing and no indexing. So the real work from the library was about ensuring that the content that we got would fit within inside of the tools that we were using, so Pressbooks and that sort of supports. But the actual editorial work was with the faculty members. So the focus was on layout, open licensing, as well as front matter. So these are some of those 10 projects that were supported. They ran a gamut, so there was simulated case studies, which was for social work, which focused on improving lives of women and girls through integrative health practices. There was also an accessibility open textbook from calculus, which was really supporting the creation of accessible open math texts for students with visual impairments. So it ran the gamut in terms of the kinds of content that were actually published. So in addition to this project work, assessment was a part of Leonora's work, not mine. I'm reading the notes, so I'm saying our. In addition to conducting interviews of 6 faculty partners who indicated the important work and role the library had in their OER development, specifically related to copyright, Creative Commons licensing, publishing, project managing, etc. There was also an evaluation of students in the classes that were using the OER, so a survey was delivered. What they found from this was that in terms of learning experience, that over 80% preferred open textbooks to traditional ones, and none preferred the traditional textbooks at all. I think we can understand where that answer is coming from. Also, when compared to other similarly demanding classes, had the use of open textbooks reduced the overall cost of the class, and about 75% agreed, some weren't sure, and then none disagreed. So there's probably a disconnect between the open piece having an impact on student saving. But one of the more interesting quotes from a student was, since our prof wrote the book, it was designed specifically for the class. It made it really easy to refer back to the textbook when looking over lecture notes, concepts, and problems. So they saw a really integrated approach to their materials because it all was written and produced and delivered by the same person. So major takeaways, the library can definitely add value to the process of helping developing open education resources. We have knowledge in copyright, definitely knowledge in Creative Commons licensing, the ability to deal with the publishing standards, the front matter, as well as being able to give DOI, so digital object identifiers, to material. Accessibility through metadata and platforms, that's what libraries do. We make things accessible, so we understand those processes around attaching metadata to content and then making it available through various databases and spaces. And then the digital preservation piece, so the long-term archiving of objects. Pressbooks, it's easy to use and effective. There's a lot of power to it, like interactivity with H5P as well as the LaTeX conversion. And there was a lot of peer support. So it wasn't just UBC Library attempting this on their own. There's local post-secondary institutions like KPU that are doing similar projects, BC Campus, of course, and Open Textbook Networks. Some of the things that need to be considered is there's a format proliferation of open publishing tools out there, and that is not going to stop. So Pressbooks is just one tool, but there are many others and many more that may come along that have added benefit. So there's having to have an awareness around what is coming up and how to integrate that into this space. There's interactive elements will likely outstrip that standard e-publishing software. So right now we're still kind of running on the traditional notion of what a book is and what it looks like. But as time goes on, I think that that kind of model is going to change. The question of what is an edition is an area of constantly updating content is an issue. So we often see traditional textbooks, it will be edition 1, 2, 3, 4, but if in an open education resource that can be downloaded, modified, you can get well into hundreds of editions in a very short period of time. So how to manage that is an interesting issue. Pedagogy and publishing have become increasingly intertwined, so we're having students that are creating content, and that's hugely beneficial for their own learning processes and also beneficial for the world in terms of adding value back, as well as more conventional kind of publishing processes are becoming, our projects are becoming more challenging in this space because again, that open, it's hard to track something when it's made openly available. Like you were saying, somebody can use the content, but who and how? It's an issue to consider. So next steps, with the announcement of the OER fund, the library is now boosting its direct support for faculty and working with CTLT. So there's more support in terms of finding open education resources that faculty are interested in. There's a service around that. Publishing using open journal systems as well as Pressbooks. Library has support there as well as making the content available through a variety of different repository spaces and assisting with metadata. So these pieces are now available in the library and is a direct result from this initial pilot as well as the OER fund being developed. There also is an expanded digital publishing service at the skullcoms.ubc.ca website, so you can find all of the information about how to get that support from the library there. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin. So as I'm sitting in the front, it's incredibly uncomfortable to turn around. So if you guys want to move out to be able to see, you're welcome to do that. And we'll come back when we do the questions. So just my neck is tough. Yes. So next I'd like to introduce Agnes Dantomont and Jonathan Verrett from Applied Science.
Thanks, Christina. And we also have a colleague who's worked with us, Nagara Morandi, quite a bit on this project, but she's away on maternity leave with her firstborn, so that's great news. So we're here representing the project, and I'll kind of give an introduction, and Agnes will talk a bit about our evaluation afterwards. So as a background, WebWorks is an open source online homework system, and what will happen is a student will log in, they'll be assigned a set of numbers which are generally unique, and then they'll be allowed multiple attempts, up to unlimited attempts at it, and they'll be given instant feedback as to whether it's correct or incorrect. So the computer's kind of calculating what that answer is for their unique numbers. There's about over 35,000 problems in something called the Open Problem Library, which is stored on this website called GitHub, which anybody can access. There's these kind of code snippets of all these problems, and they're categorized into different subject areas. So you can see the subject areas on the right side of the slide there. Most of these are math subjects, and so there's only about 260 engineering problems. And when we started, there was only kind of two areas where these problems were located. So UBC engineering students, they take first year calculus as an example of a course, and in that course they use WebWorks. So they're already introduced to WebWorks. So it's very easy for us to implement it in our engineering courses, but of course we didn't have questions that we could base it off of. So our goal was to develop a bunch of web work problems in second year engineering, because that's where we have a lot of overlap in different subjects. So this had been going on before we started this project with the TLEF. It was going on in the electrical and computer engineering department, and they had run a student survey where students were relatively happy about using WebWork, liked the lack of cost of it, liked the immediate feedback. There's also a student survey run in MEC, where you can see some of the results there. They compared kind of Blackboard. Blackboard has a system back when we were using Blackboard before Canvas, where you could put in something similar, but it would re-randomize the numbers each time, which kind of frustrated students. So you can see, I think, the result of that in their responses there to that survey. And then in chemical and biological engineering, when I was using it, I looked at sort of TA and instructor working hours before using WebWork in 2016, and then after using WebWork in 2017 and 2018. And there was a big increase in my hours, which are there on the bottom, course instructor hours, creating the problem sets. But then after that, it's a bit smoother and quite a bit easier to use them. And my TAs had more time to interact with students rather than grading paper assignments, let's say, entirely. So before this project, we had sort of these three departments working in isolation, not a lot of questions available openly, and no sharing of questions across topics that are similar between disciplines. So one example of that is fluid mechanics, which is in mechanical engineering and chemical and biological engineering. So we kind of rounded up these second year classes that were in multiple departments, and here's kind of a broad chart of what this looks like. So you can see here fluid mechanics, chemical engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, dynamics between a few biomedical engineering and mechanical engineering. I won't go through all of these, but just to give you an idea, these are some of the topic areas, and then the number of questions that we aim to create in each of those topic areas for these courses. There are some that have a few less, like mining, that kind of jumped on afterwards. So those are the difference between year one subjects was when we kind of went out and found a bunch of courses that were across disciplines, and year two, some subjects kind of came to us and had heard about us, which was nice, and wanted questions created. So to give you an idea of what this question creation process looks like, basically what we tried to model was to have guidance from the course instructor or course instructors in terms of the type of content they'd like to have, the types of questions, the areas, right? A graduate student would go and develop a problem, then they would create kind of a rough sketch of the problem. So that's kind of the first picture you see there on the left at the bottom with the variables. We'd have an undergraduate student who is working with us who would code all the problems from there, kind of taking that rough problem and turning it into a finalized problem, which is what you see on the left. There was some graphics support either from that student or from somebody else doing the graphics. So like you see, taking those hand-drawn images and trying to turn them into something quite a bit nicer. And then we test it on the students the first year, get all the bugs out of it, and then upload it to the OPL, the Open Problem Library, afterwards. So now from that 260 questions, what this looks like is we have about 1,000 questions that are in testing or contributed from UBC. Also, because of this work, we've created new taxonomies. So each of these subject areas, we started with 2, now we have something like 13 up here. And that's allowed us to take in questions from other institutions that have been created. So that number has gone up from 260 to 327, with another 324 from UBC. So I'll let Agnes talk a bit about evaluation of the project.
Yeah, so we did have 13 partner courses last year, and in each term we had a pre and post survey for the students. The pre-survey was focused on what's their past experience with online homework and what do they find is important about online homework, and then in the post survey we were more asking about our questions. So I won't cover all of the results, but a few highlights. So we actually asked them if they'd used WebWork before, and if they'd used other systems before. And out of the 331 respondents, the vast majority had used WebWork before. And when we compared statistically, WebWork won out in all of these areas. So easy to use, easy to navigate, enhanced my learning, motivated me to persist, and I want to use this in the future. So the feedback being clear and easy to access, the other systems won out on that one. When we were asking a post-survey about our new problems, well, they noticed we had a few errors in the problems. Unfortunately, we found that even the amount of testing that we'd put in was not sufficient. We ended up putting in more testing for the second term. They also felt they weren't quite the same level of difficulty, and that might be just because of having one instructor kind of helping us create the problems and multiple instructors applying them. They have different desires for having easier problems or harder problems or how they match. But they liked our images. And then we were asking about how does this motivate you to learn? Well, we actually got pretty high marks in them being motivated to try and solve the problems, to attempt and to successfully complete the problems. So we felt that that was probably an indication of pretty good learning, and we still got good marks in web work enhanced my learning. We got quite positive instructor responses too. They saw the value of having the students get that feedback immediately rather than hand in some homework, get it back a week later marked up, and are they ever going to go back to that problem again? Probably not. It reduced marking time, it provided more feedback. They liked the fact that there were shared problems, and the instructors themselves can adapt those problems. Say if they're using a slightly different notation, they just change a few things in the code and it's done. We had on-call support, so we had a co-op student on call to help with errors in the problems, and there were, so we were having sort of a 1 or 2 day turnaround to fix errors. And we actually were able to convert a whole bunch of problems from Desire to Learn and the iMath AS system as well. It was long creating these problems. We figure between 1.5 hours to 2 hours per problem, including designing the problem, creating the graphics, coding it, and testing it. So quite a lot of effort per problem. And of course, we have to make these professional looking graphics. We don't have to, but it really makes a difference in how the problems look. And obviously we had errors in the code, and we had a problem with tolerances in some cases where the students could be a little off due to rounding errors and they wouldn't get the right answer. What would have helped? More funds. It was a pretty expensive process to create these problems. Support for instructor time to help us. That was a real barrier with some instructors who just couldn't give enough time to even tell the students developing the problems what they needed. To have co-creation opportunities with the students would have been great as well, and better documentation for web work in general and some more local expertise on coding would have been great. And we've got some acknowledgements, and if you want to use any of our problems, they're all available. We'll happily help you with that. So thanks.
Great, thank you. And we have one more presentation by Siobhan McElduff from Classical, Near Eastern, and Religious Studies. And then after that, hopefully you're thinking about your questions, because we will have time for questions.
So unfortunately my computer won't go on this, so you won't get any images, but I do have, because I'm old school, I'm in classics, so yeah, so there's 3 bits. One is the syllabus for the course, which kind of explains the content. Oh, hang on, this is my thing. And then one is the first assignment, which I had to change during the course. And one was my sample first assignment, which really didn't solve some of the problems. So I taught a class last year called Un-Roman Romans. So that's bandits, exiles, sex workers, witches, and other outsiders in the Roman Empire. And it was a course where I suggested it and thought, it's 2018, there'll be loads of stuff. I'll be able to find a book that... And I went through about 20 textbooks, readers, and in every one I found something enormously offensive and actually shockingly opposite, unaware of, oh, I didn't go to that thing. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, so go back a bit. All right, so, and I don't want to... The subject matter we were dealing with, if you know anything about the Romans, is they're horrible people. They're horrible. They're better than the ancient Greeks, but that's a really low bar. And so the material we were dealing with was deeply offensive. The list of people they don't like goes from gravediggers through to lesbians, through to like people who cross-dress, people who have fringe on their tunics, you know, or are maybe enchanting the richest widow in town to marry them, even though they're 20 years younger. So, and so you can imagine, I didn't really, so the students were being asked to read very difficult material, and I was like, well, I'm not going to give them other material that's also transphobic or sexist or colonialist or just straight out racist without even being aware of it. And I mean, it saddens me to say this as someone who's in classics. So I decided that I'd put an OER together for a course on spectacles in ancient Rome. And I thought I'd do that, but then I realized that the problem with that is that you're not often very aware of what help students need. And I work with awful Romans a lot, so I'm often gliding past terrible things they're doing, and someone will be like, hang on, can we go back to that bit? And I'm like, oh right, yeah, they just did do that. Or you don't really realize that students, like, there's a lot of help that they need that has to do with them not, like, they don't know anything about Roman history, nor should they have to. So you have to explain some basic facts that, like, a lot of textbooks don't work with. So I thought, well, I could put together some out-of-copyright translations. I could add some notes, introduce them, and work on them in class, and have students work to create an OER themselves. So what they would do is they take on a very small area of text or image or something else that they wanted to work on out of a list. It kind of expanded beyond the list. And we would work towards, in a 3-stage process, them creating something that could go out as a piece of public scholarship as part of a Pressbooks primary source reader on how awful the Romans were with dealing with difference. So I did that. It was a student of close to about 34 students. I would say I would not do it again with that many students because it was an immense amount of work. It involved, the first thing you have there is the first assignment, which was like just to write up a proposal, come up with a subject, look through this. Everybody suggested way too much, so I wrote a response which was like, no, you can't write on all of the terrible things the Romans did there. You'll have to write on this one poor person, or these 3 years in this one poor person's life that we know about. So I had students work on a range of topics, anything from transgender issues to grave diggers, to sex workers, to actors, to accusations of prostitution that got flung around a lot, like in the Roman Senate. And each one of them, even though very few of them knew anything really about Greek or Latin, they worked on a section, and by the end of it, through a 3-step process, they produced at the end a piece of scholarship that's going into the reader that will be eventually published and finished online. It's still in the process because it's a lot of work and it needs a lot of careful handling because the subjects are really problematic. I would say, I would highly recommend, if you have anything you can do with students, I would do it. Like, it's a great experience. The marking was awesome because you mark things, they have to read it for the next stage. There was no wasted marking. It was a lot of marking. It was a lot of effort. The students thoroughly enjoyed it. They enjoyed realizing that they could contribute to scholarship. They also really enjoyed realizing they know more about race, gender, and whole sexuality than many academics. Like, it was like very obvious. Our midterm was, here's a bunch of passages introduced by various classicists with their names removed for everyone's sake. How do you feel about these? And they were very perceptive. They were very good scholars. They understand some things very well. They understand difference very well. They understand how to talk about difference without claiming that your position is the only right, true one because of that one time you saw a person on the beach, like literally, like, or they don't claim things like slaves in Greece must have been happy because they had the Parthenon. So stuff like that. So this was part of my project, and it worked really well. I'm building it at the moment. It got a course release from the Public Humanities Hub. It will be published, and hopefully some of it will also be used outside of UBC for students who are really interested in difference and the history of difference. I mean, it doesn't take much realization to realize that classics is super attractive to white supremacists. Fascism comes from fasces. And so there's also an issue in my field of the need for serious interventions to show people that antiquity was not all just white, straight men. It was a vast compendium of individuals who created the Roman Empire. And so that's really basically it. I have a lot more things. What you have there is the syllabus, which you will note only goes halfway through. I had to give up my right to control the syllabus. I had to allow them to vote on subjects they wanted to do, so this also means you have to give up a lot of control. I had to talk about a lot of topics I don't know anything about because I allowed them to suggest the topics as long as they fell within a certain area. And that means that, yeah, you have to expose yourself. I made a lot of mistakes. If you do the first assignment, make it credit, no credit. It eventually had to go. The one problem, though, that the students have was, and I think maybe we have done too good a job with this, is they're obsessed with being accused of plagiarism for everything. It was actually a serious problem. They wanted to footnote everything, and I spent a lot of time going, no, that's just life, that's just dates. You don't need to footnote that. And I think that asking them to transition from traditional papers to this type of scholarship that's open and public creates some ethical issues and creates some other issues with how to cite people that are not very well covered by some of our current materials, and that was a big problem. What would really help was time, because if you do this and you decide to involve students, please be aware it's an enormous amount of work. The feedback has to get back within 10 days to be effective, otherwise they kind of switch off. So that was the downside. So yeah, more marking help, more student help would have helped. Great, thank you. And I have a blog on Roman Romans, so you can Google that if you want any of the material.
It's up here, Un-Roman Romans.
Yes,
Is that
so
it?
yeah, all of the stuff is there, a whole bunch of the readers, prepare to be deeply offended. I'm sorry, I can't help it, you will be offended.
Okay.
It's just, if you're
By
not,
the Romans, yes. So I'd like to throw it out to questions from you all, for anybody or all of our panelists. Go ahead.
I have a question. Elise, first I want to get your permission.
Do we need a mic? Okay. Okay.
First, I want to ask your permission to steal free as in beer, free as in speech as an analogy, because it was great.
It's not mine.
It's not now. That's something I'm very interested in. I work in the library as well, connected with the education faculty, and very interested in instructor and faculty motivations. So some of you explicitly talked about your motivations, and you folks did as well. Some of it came out as your original motivations, and then you found benefits as well as challenges. So I want to ask the panel, I know your motives, about motives and if they stayed the same as you worked through working on your OER.
So there's a story that I think is instructive about specifically freeze and beer. So that was one of the big original motivations, was just sticker shock. And I teach a number of courses in the math department, and some of them use traditional textbooks, and one of them uses a really expensive traditional textbooks, and students just don't buy it. And the homework is out of the textbook, and they just say, I can't afford it, I'm just going to eat that 10% of my grade, and it's heartbreaking. And it comes time to study for the final, and I'm talking to a student, and I realize, oh, you haven't done any of the homework because you couldn't afford this textbook. But I feel like the cost, until recently, has not been considered kind of a highbrow motivation. You mentioned a study that I think maybe your folks did, where you had good data showing that a lot of UBC students don't buy this textbook because it's too expensive, which matches my anecdotal data. But I'm up for tenure this year, and when I was preparing my documents, one of my committee members said, well, don't stress too much the cost savings, because this is somehow not such a noble goal. So for the beginning, that's a good starting motivation, but then, once you have things that are adopted and you're using them, you just want to make them better and better, and you want to fix all the issues, and you want everything to work, and you want it to be exactly how you want. So I think cost was a good motivation to start it, and then the sort of personalization was a good motivation to keep going.
I think for myself, it started with student costs as well. So we have these integrated courses in my program in second year where we have 3 or 5 subjects smushed together into one giant course. And one year, one of the instructors put on a paid homework system where the other homework was free, and the students really didn't like that. But also, we silo content into these individual courses, but really in engineering there's a lot of overlapping content. And one of the reasons we have this combined course is to give students a problem in more than one subject area. So they have to use knowledge from more than one subject to solve this problem. You can't get that in publisher systems. They have these siloed sets of questions. And so this was an opportunity to also create questions that bring in more richness, that put things in context, that require the students to use multiple skills from multiple areas.
Nothing else to add? Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, Will?
So several of your projects hired students for pretty robust things from graphic design to accessibility. How hard was it to find students with those skills that you were seeking?
I think the library did it for me. Leonora, sorry.
Yeah. I unfortunately can't speak to this particular project. But I can speak to other open education projects out of the library. And while they might not have the specific skill set that's very tied to this tool or this pedagogy or something, what is really wonderful is that the students are increasingly motivated because of not just the whole idea of the advocacy around cost savings for students and that, but they see kind of higher value in open on a larger kind of global level, that what's coming out of the public institution should be publicly available. So they buy into those sort of motivations maybe more than some people that have been here for longer. So if that's the case, then you get students that are highly motivated, which equates to really good work.
There is one question though, I think, depending on what you're working with, and obviously this probably doesn't affect calculus, and this is way more controversy in the world of calculus that you're all starting to, is if you're asking a student to work on something that's problematic and their name's going to be attached to it, you have to let them know. Like if you're hiring someone, say, to work on a reader, say, well, like I am, they're going to be writing about difficult things, and you can imagine in a whole host of like arts or other related subjects, if you have to do a reader on, say, Nazi Germany, you Google that person's name, so you need to like let them know that this is a permanent connection. If you're using their scholarship or if they're working on the material, this connection will remain all their lives, so they should be aware what that entails. If it's a technical thing, it might not affect as much, but if you're doing something that is slightly going to be problematic, particularly if they're from backgrounds where that might, or professions where being quirky or slightly different is not a great thing. So that's one of the things about dealing with wide-ranging students that you really have to consider, is you are giving them a permanent record. That can be good and that can be bad. So that would be one thing I would warn anybody working in arts at least.
In our project, we had a couple of really great students right out of second year, all primed with this knowledge of our problem areas, to the point where our first student worked for us full-time for 8 months, part-time for 4 months, and then presented at a national conference based on his work. So really awesome.
Previous question. You focus on kind of some strengths and good things today about OER, but I think just to focus on learner's perspective, did you get any feedback, negative feedback? What challenges the learners had?
Errors. Yeah. Errors and tolerances, they were frustrated. And we got a lot of requests that they would really like hints and sort of this adaptive platform which would suggest the next problem to try, which as far as we know isn't available openly yet.
No, I had no problems. My students actually really, really liked it. The only problem was some of them wanted, you had to set time limits because otherwise they would have gone crazy, like finishing things. You have to be careful of students who've got impetus to finish all the things. So they really liked it once we went for times. They were very worried about what would, like if they're working on something for this, they're worried what would count as good enough to be included. So on some degrees, like I felt like when I was working with students, at least to create, because we were working to create it, it was very important to give them outs and to say, if you spent 10 hours on this, that's okay, even if it's like, even if you haven't done very much, because some stuff is going to be harder than others. So yeah, if you're using them as, if you're assessing them on it, that was critical. But they're really, I didn't bring in valuations, but they really liked it. They felt like it was very useful and were pleased that they had done something that would be semi-permanent.
Library question bank thing, so the students also created it or uploaded their questions.
So the questions that we had created, so those were created by kind of, let's say, TAs, mostly graduate students who had TA'd the course before, then tested on students, and then we uploaded them to the problem bank. And so, I mean, anybody can go in. I think Agnes has a funny story about a student going in to correct one of her questions in GitHub. My students weren't that savvy, unfortunately. But yeah, so anybody can then go and access it and use it. And WebWorks open source, so anybody can use that as well.
WebWorks, I was wondering, do you ever get concerned about students looking at the questions in the open problem library to help their grade?
Yeah, anything that is posted in the OPL, they can find, and clearly one of my students did. But ultimately, the stuff's for practice anyway. They can get the answer off their friend just as easily as finding it on GitHub. So if they're going that way, they're not really getting the benefit of it.
And I think mostly the marking, I don't know, in my class, it's like maybe 10%, 5%, something like that. You get to the midterm and the final, they're worth 60%. So if you don't know the material and you can't perform it on your own, I mean, so I think students with that, generally most of them are swayed anyways.
I have one question. How easy was it to handle multi-part questions? So did you have any multi-part questions where had part A, B, C, where part B uses part A, and so on and so forth? And if it was an issue, if a student gets part A, they're probably going to get part B and C wrong. Is there a way to kind of like take their answer, use it in part B or C, and kind of make it still help them to get the points and maybe check that they understand part B's and C's or the following parts without understanding, maybe getting the part entirely correctly?
Yeah, so there are a couple. Do you want to?
I don't know. I had a few multi-part questions, and I mean, generally, we've left the students to have unlimited attempts. I think it's the same in MEC. And so, you know, what that would generally signal to students, okay, I understand this first part of the problem, but then the second part, I maybe need to talk to a colleague or come see a TA, for example. And so that's how mostly I dealt with multi-part questions. There is an opportunity to put in hints in the program, but you have to program those in. It's a little intensive, and you almost have to predict kind of where students are going wrong, which sometimes when you look at what their numbers are, you can kind of see it, but it's a little hard to kind of pre-format that. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yes. There is a second method where you can lock out the second and third and fourth parts until they get the first part right, but mostly we didn't do that. They could see all 4 parts and put in the answers and then get individual feedback on each of those parts.
One course where the exams happen online through WebWork. But of course, when you have a math exam online through WebWork, you want to have multiple parts, but there's always that issue of like, how are you going to be able to control how much they know, how much they don't? Because if they got part A wrong, even if they didn't know everything, they would just not get any points, which is kind of unfair. So you kind of have to find a way to kind of mitigate that somehow. So I was wondering whether you kind of face such a problem and how you handle it.
Yeah, I know that one of our instructors in Thermo decided to produce check off all the assumptions you're making in this problem. That was the first part, and then start giving answers. So I think there are some ways to get the students to give you more information about what they're doing.
This question to library or Will. When we just
that developed some of the courses, sometimes the images, always relevant good images, we need to pay. So I'm wondering, the free images, the quality is not very good. So is that this kind of OER funding, is that it's possible potentially? I mean, for the image, the free resources, something like that?
Do you want to start?
Whether the OER fund, I don't know whether, we haven't talked about that.
We haven't talked about that.
Yeah, so generally, when it comes to licensing content of any sort for an open context, an open resource, it's generally never goes forward, mainly because often you license things for a specific audience, and when you're making it open, I can have an unlimited audience. So I do believe that the funding could potentially be used, but it could also be used for graphic designers or students to help create images as well. Christina, would you have any thoughts there?
No, I guess I'm not quite sure if you're asking, could you use the funding to pay for an image to go in?
When I develop a course, we need a lot of images, but all the relevant images we had to buy. It's the free images always, the quality is not really good for the course. In that case, I was just wondering if there are free open sources have a good, the data, like a good image packages available would be great for the course, learning designer, something like that.
Yeah, I think that the issue with paying for access to images through the fund is that you could get permission to use it in that thing, but they might not give you permission to make it public to everybody else or to let other people reuse it, so that causes some issues. Jeff has got.
Maybe just to follow up that, we've seen quite a few TLDF projects where they use the funding to create open source or Creative Commons illustrations. For instance, a lot of anatomy images and documents have been created so people don't have to pay for licensing.
Yeah.
So one thing we might hope for is people will actually produce images and then Creative Commons license them using this funding.
And there was also a question about whether there are good quality images available.
Yeah, and that's where you could talk to the library, where we can try to find images that could be used with Creative Commons license. There's no guarantees. Open education resources are everywhere, so finding good quality is difficult, but we definitely will help with trying to do that.
And I'm afraid it is the end of our hour, so please join me in thanking our panel.